What if I told you that the woman working the overnight shift at Pete's 24-hour diner in small town, Nebraska was the same person who ended the longest war in American history with a single bullet from 2 miles away? What if the server who quietly refilled your coffee and asked if you wanted more pie was responsible for bringing home 50,000 troops and saving countless lives? This is the story of Elena Vasquez and how the most extraordinary shot in military history remained hidden behind a name tag and an apron for 8 long years. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So, if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Elena Vasquez was invisible in the way that only night shift workers in forgotten places can be. At 34, she moved through Pete's 24-hour diner in Millfield, Nebraska like a ghost, her black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her movements efficient and purposeful as she served truckers, insomniacs, and the occasional lost traveler who had wandered off Interstate 80. The diner itself was a relic from the 1960s, all chrome and red vinyl booths, with a neon sign that flickered between open and op, depending on the weather. It sat at the edge of town like a ship run aground, surrounded by endless cornfields that stretched to the horizon in every direction. She had been working the midnight to 8 shift for 3 years now, ever since she had quietly moved to Millfield, with nothing but a duffel bag and a determination to disappear. The regulars knew her as the efficient waitress who never got their orders wrong, who could balance 4 plates on her left arm while pouring coffee with her right, who always remembered how they liked their eggs. They saw a woman who seemed content with her small life, who drove a 15-year-old Toyota Camry with Nebraska plates and lived in a 1-bedroom apartment above Martha's flower shop on Main Street. What they didn't see were the scars on her hands from climbing over razor wire in the Hindu Kush Mountains, or the way her eyes automatically cataloged every entrance and exit when she entered a room. They didn't notice how she positioned herself with her back to walls, or how her seemingly casual glances out the diner's windows were actually systematic sweeps of the surrounding area. They had no idea that the woman who cheerfully asked "More coffee, hun?" had once held a enemy position under observation for 6 days straight without moving, surviving on rainwater and sheer determination. Elena had chosen Millfield specifically because it was the kind of place where no one asked too many questions, where a woman could blend into the background of agricultural rhythms and small-town routines. The population of 1,847 souls included mostly farming families whose roots went back 4 generations, retirees who had moved there for the low cost of living, and a handful of people like herself who had reasons for wanting to be left alone. It was a place where excitement meant the high school football team making it to regionals, where the biggest news in months had been the installation of a new traffic light at the intersection of Main and Elm. Her apartment reflected the same deliberate ordinariness as her job. The furnished space came with a couch that had seen better decades, a kitchenette barely large enough for 1 person, and a bathroom where the shower head had exactly 2 settings, barely a trickle or painful blast. She had added almost nothing personal to the space except for a small collection of paperback novels, a coffee maker that actually worked, and a wooden box that she kept locked in the bedroom closet. The box contained the only evidence of who she had been before Millfield, her medals, her discharge papers, and a single photograph of her unit taken 3 days before the mission that changed everything the other waitresses at Pete's treated Elena with the casual friendliness reserved for co-workers who shared shifts but not secrets. There was Betty, a grandmother of 5 who had been working at the diner since the Carter administration and knew every piece of gossip in 3 counties. There was Carla, a nursing student who picked up extra shifts to pay for textbooks and complained constantly about her boyfriend. And there was Jennifer, fresh out of high school and saving money for cosmetology school, who spent most of her shifts texting and taking selfies when Pete wasn't looking. They all liked Elena well enough. She was reliable, never called in sick. always picked up extra shifts when needed, and had a knack for handling difficult customers without creating drama. When the quarterly staff meetings came around, Pete always praised her work ethic and punctuality. When customers left complaints, they were never about Alina. She had mastered the art of being competent without being memorable, helpful without being noteworthy. The regular customers saw her as part of the diner's furniture, as predictable and comforting as the smell of bacon grease and the hum of the coffee machine. There was Frank, a retired farmer who came in every morning at 5:30 for black coffee and wheat toast, who always sat in booth 3 and read yesterday's paper while he ate. There was Marie, who worked the early shift at the county courthouse and always ordered the same egg white omelet with whole wheat toast. There was a rotating cast of long-haul truckers who knew her as the waitress who kept their coffee cups full and never judged them for ordering pie for breakfast. To all of them, Elena was simply Elena, the quiet night shift waitress who never complained, never gossiped, never seemed to have much of a life outside the diner. They saw someone who seemed content with her small existence, who never talked about big dreams or distant places. If anyone had bothered to create a character sketch of Elena Vasquez, they would have used words like reliable, unassuming, and settled. She shopped for groceries at the local Piggly Wiggly, got her hair cut at Donna's beauty salon every 6 weeks, and occasionally rented movies from the Red Box outside the pharmacy. Her days off were spent in equally unremarkable ways. She would walk the quiet streets of Millfield, sometimes stopping at the library to exchange her finished paperbacks for new ones. She tended a small herb garden on the fire escape outside her apartment window, growing basil and oregano that she used in the simple meals she cooked for herself. On Sundays, she sometimes attended services at the Methodist Church, sitting in the back pew and leaving immediately after the final hymn, politely declining invitations to coffee hour or potluck dinners. The Methodist congregation, led by Pastor Williams, saw her as a shy newcomer who might eventually open up and become more involved in church activities. The librarian, Mrs. Henderson, appreciated her quiet demeanor and the fact that she always returned books on time. The pharmacist, Dr. Kim, knew her as the customer who always paid cash and never needed anything stronger than aspirin. To the postal worker who delivered to her building, she was just another name on a mailbox, someone who received very little mail and never seemed to be expecting packages. What none of them could have imagined was that 8 years earlier, Elena had been Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez of the 3rd Marine Raider Battalion, one of the most elite sniper units in the United States military. They couldn't have conceived that the woman who carefully counted out exact change for her grocery purchases had once been responsible for intelligence-gathering operations that saved entire battalions. They would never have believed that their quiet night shift waitress had spent 18 months in some of the most dangerous territory on Earth, moving through mountains and valleys where a single mistake meant death. The transformation from Staff Sergeant Vasquez to Elena, the waitress, had been as deliberate as a military operation. She had studied how to be ordinary the same way she had once studied wind patterns and bullet trajectories. She had learned to speak more softly, to make her movements less precise, to occupy space differently. She had practiced looking uncertain about things she knew intimately, had trained herself to appear overwhelmed by situations she could have handled in her sleep. The irony was not lost on her that the same skills that had made her invisible to enemy forces in Afghanistan now made her invisible to the residents of Millfield. The ability to blend into her environment, to observe without being observed, to move through spaces without drawing attention. These had been survival skills in combat, and they were survival skills now, just serving a different purpose. Then, invisibility had meant the difference between completing the mission and becoming a casualty. Now, it meant the difference between peaceful anonymity and the kind of attention she had spent 8 years trying to avoid. Her fellow veterans from the unit would not have recognized her if they had walked into Pete's diner at 3 in the morning. The woman who had once carried a 50-pound pack across 20 miles of hostile terrain now complained about sore feet after busy shifts. The sniper who had once remained motionless for 16 hours while tracking a high-value target now acted like standing for 8 hours serving coffee was the most demanding thing she had ever done. The Marine who had once briefed generals on enemy positions now pretended to be confused by the diner's new computerized ordering system. But sometimes, in the quiet hours between 2 and 4 in the morning, when the diner was empty except for the occasional trucker stopping for coffee, Elena would catch herself falling back into old habits. Her eyes would automatically track movement outside the windows, cataloging vehicles and noting their occupants. She would position herself with clear sightlines to all entrances, her body unconsciously adopting the alert stance of someone trained to react to threats. In these moments, the muscle memory of 8 years of elite military service would surface, reminding her of who she had been before she became who she needed to be. The closest anyone in Millfield had come to glimpsing her past was when Jimmy Patterson, a local teenager with more attitude than sense, had tried to rob the diner on a slow Tuesday night. Elena had been alone except for one customer, an elderly man who was quietly finishing his late dinner. Jimmy had burst through the front door with a baseball bat, demanding money from the register, clearly believing he was intimidating a helpless woman. What happened next had been over so quickly that the elderly customer later told police he wasn't entirely sure what he had. Witness. Elena had moved with a speed and precision that seemed to defy physics, disarming Jimmy and restraining him before he had fully processed what was happening. When Sheriff Morrison arrived, he found Jimmy sitting quietly in a booth, his hands zip-tied behind his back with plastic restraints that Elena claimed to have found behind the counter, though no one could remember ever seeing them there before. Her explanation, that she had taken a self-defense class in college, satisfied everyone who heard it, though it didn't account for the professional efficiency of Jimmy's restraint or the fact that he had been subdued without suffering so much as a bruise the incident had earned Elena a brief moment of local fame as the brave waitress who stopped a robbery, but she had deflected the attention with characteristic modesty, insisting that she had just gotten lucky and that Jimmy was probably more scared than dangerous anyway. The story had made the front page of the Millfield Gazette, a newspaper so small that a cat stuck in a tree usually qualified as news, but Elena had declined to be interviewed, claiming she was too shaken up to talk about it. What the residents of Millfield, Nebraska didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined in their wildest dreams, was that their quiet night shift waitress had once changed the course of history with a single squeeze of a trigger from a distance that most people couldn't even see clearly with binoculars. They didn't know that the woman who served them coffee and pie had once been trusted with a mission so classified that most of the details remained redacted in Pentagon files 8 years later. They had no idea that Elena Vasquez was living proof that heroes don't always look like what people expect them to look like, and that sometimes the most extraordinary people are hiding in plain sight, serving coffee at 3 in the morning in diners at the edge of nowhere. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, slipped under Elena's apartment door while she slept after her shift. The envelope bore the official seal of the Nebraska National Guard, and for a moment, Elena's carefully constructed world tilted on its axis. She had spent 8 years ensuring that no official correspondence could find her, had gone to extraordinary lengths to sever all connections to her military past. Yet here was proof that someone, somewhere, still had her current address. Inside was an invitation that made her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. The Nebraska National Guard was hosting their annual Veterans Appreciation Day at the Hastings Shooting Complex, just 45 minutes from Millfield. The event was designed to honor local veterans and promote marksmanship programs for young people interested in military careers. Local media would be present, and several distinguished guests were expected, including retired Marine Corps Colonel Patricia Hayes, who would be speaking about women in combat roles. The invitation was addressed to Ms. Elena Vasquez, with no mention of her military rank or service record, suggesting that whoever had sent it knew she was a veteran but not the specifics of her background. Still, the fact that it had found her at all was deeply unsettling. Elena had chosen Millfield precisely because it was the kind of place where federal databases and military records seemed irrelevant, where her past should have remained buried under layers of bureaucratic indifference and rural isolation. She might have simply ignored the invitation, thrown it away, and pretended it had never arrived, if not for the handwritten note at the bottom. Elena, your country needs you to be visible again. There are young women who need to see what's possible. Please consider attending. Colonel Hayes. The personal touch suggested that this wasn't a mass mailing, that someone had specifically sought her out and thought her presence was important, enough to track her down. Elena spent 3 days staring at the invitation, weighing her options, and trying to calculate the risks. Part of her wanted to pack her few belongings and disappear again, to find another small town in another state where she could rebuild her carefully constructed anonymity. But another part of her, a part she had tried to suppress for 8 years, was curious about Colonel Hayes and what she might know about Elena's service record. More troubling still was the possibility that her past was catching up to her, whether she wanted it to or not. The decision was ultimately made for her by Betty, the grandmother waitress who had worked at Pete's since the Carter administration. Betty had been sorting through mail at the diner's counter when she noticed Elena's troubled expression during their shift change. With the well-meaning persistence of someone who had raised 5 children and managed to extract confessions from all of them, Betty had gradually coaxed the basic details out of Elena. There was a veterans event. Elena was invited. She wasn't sure if she wanted to go. "Honey," Betty had said, refilling Elena's coffee cup without being asked, "you've been hiding from something ever since you got to this town. I don't know what it is, and I'm not asking. But sometimes the thing you're running from is exactly the thing you need to face." Betty's advice came with the weight of 7 decades of life experience and a grandmother's intuitive understanding of when someone was carrying more than they should. The conversation had taken place during the quiet period between breakfast and lunch rush, when the diner held only a few regulars reading newspapers and nursing coffee. Elena had found herself explaining, in carefully vague terms, that she was a veteran who preferred not to talk about her service. Betty had listened with the patient attention of someone who understood that some stories took time to tell, and some wounds took longer to heal than others. "My grandson Tommy came back from Iraq different," Betty had said quietly, wiping down the counter with methodical strokes. "Took him 3 years before he could talk about what happened over there. But when he finally did, when he started going to those veteran meetings, that's when he started getting better. Sometimes you've got to remember who you were before you can figure out who you're supposed to be now." Elena had tried to explain that her situation was different, that her reasons for maintaining privacy were more complicated than simple trauma recovery. But Betty had fixed her with the look that had probably intimidated her children into confessing decades of misbehavior. "Elena, I've been watching people for 70 years, and I can tell when someone's carrying a secret that's eating them alive. You don't have to tell me what it is, but you need to stop letting it control your life." The conversation had continued through the remainder of Elena's shift, with Betty sharing stories about other people in Millfield who had reinvented themselves after difficult periods. There was Frank, the retired farmer who had lost his farm to bankruptcy but found purpose volunteering at the food bank. There was Dr. Kim at the pharmacy, who had come to Millfield after losing his practice in Omaha due to a malpractice suit that was later overturned. There was even Pastor Williams, who had been a corporate lawyer in Chicago before feeling called to ministry and small-town life. "This whole town is full of people who came here to start over," Betty had concluded. "The difference is, most of them figured out that you can't really start over if you're still hiding from who you used to be. You've got to integrate the old with the new, honey. That's the only way it works. Elena had left the diner that morning carrying more than just tips and the lingering smell of bacon grease. She had been carrying Betty's words and the uncomfortable recognition that her 8 years of careful anonymity might have been less about healing and more about avoiding the responsibility that came with her extraordinary background. The invitation from Colonel Hayes suddenly seemed less like an intrusion and more like an opportunity to test whether she was ready to acknowledge her past without being overwhelmed by it. The drive to Hastings on the morning of the Veterans Appreciation Day gave Elena 45 minutes to second-guess her decision approximately 17 times. She had changed clothes 3 times before leaving her apartment, finally settling on dark jeans and a plain navy blue sweater that suggested respect for the occasion without drawing attention. She had driven her aging Toyota Camry instead of asking to borrow someone's more reliable vehicle, maintaining the image of someone whose participation in the event was casual rather than significant. The Hastings shooting complex was larger and more professional than Elena had expected, with multiple ranges designed for different types of firearms training and competition. The parking lot was filled with pickup trucks displaying various military unit stickers, motorcycles with veteran organization patches, and a surprising number of vehicles driven by families with children. The atmosphere was festive rather than solemn, with the smell of barbecue competing with the distant sound of gunfire from the active ranges. Elena had intended to arrive early, scope out the event, and position herself somewhere inconspicuous, where she could observe without participating. Instead, she found herself caught in a crowd of people streaming toward the main pavilion, where Colonel Hayes was scheduled to begin the day's presentations. She was swept along with families, veterans of various ages, and what appeared to be several high school classes on field trips to learn about career opportunities in the military. The crowd was diverse in a way that surprised Elena, who had expected the event to draw primarily older male veterans. Instead, she saw women of all ages, including several who were clearly active duty personnel based on their bearing and the way they interacted with each other. There were teenagers with parents, grandparents with grandchildren, and several obvious couples where one partner was a veteran and the other was there for support. Elena found herself positioned near the back of the gathered crowd when Colonel Hayes took the podium. The colonel was an impressive woman in her early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of command presence that could silence a room without effort. She began her speech with statistics about women in military service, but quickly moved to more personal territory, talking about the barriers that had existed when she first enlisted and the progress that had been made since then. "When I joined the Marines 35 years ago," Colonel Hayes said, her voice carrying easily over the crowd, "there were entire career fields closed to women simply because of assumptions about what we could and couldn't do. Those assumptions weren't based on evidence or performance. They were based on fear and tradition and the uncomfortable truth that some people weren't ready to acknowledge that heroism comes in all shapes and sizes." Elena felt a familiar tightness in her chest as the colonel's words hit closer to home than she had anticipated. She had joined the Marines during a period when many barriers were falling, when women were being allowed into more combat roles based on capability rather than gender. But she had still faced skepticism, still had to prove herself repeatedly, still had to work twice as hard to earn half the recognition that came automatically to her male counterparts. Colonel Hayes continued, discussing the importance of mentorship and visibility for young women considering military careers. "One of the most damaging things we can do," she said, "is to let our young people believe that extraordinary service is only performed by people who look a certain way or come from certain backgrounds. We have veterans in our communities right now who have performed incredible acts of service, who have capabilities that could inspire the next generation, but who remain invisible because they don't match society's expectations of what a hero looks like." The colonel's eyes seemed to scan the crowd as she spoke, And Elena had the uncomfortable sensation that they lingered on her face longer than coincidence would suggest. She tried to tell herself that it was paranoia, that there was no way Colonel Hayes could have picked her out of a crowd of several hundred people. But the feeling persisted, along with a growing certainty that her decision to attend the event had been a mistake. The presentation continued with information about various programs available to veterans, opportunities for continued service, and resources for those struggling with the transition to civilian life. Elena found herself genuinely interested despite her anxiety, particularly in the programs designed to help veterans find meaningful work that utilized their military skills. She had been so focused on hiding her capabilities that she had never considered whether there might be ways to use them that didn't require returning to active duty or compromising her anonymity. As the formal presentation concluded, the crowd began to disperse toward various demonstration areas where different aspects of military training and capability would be showcased. Elena had planned to leave at this point, to slip away before anyone could engage her in conversation or ask questions about her own service. But as she turned toward the parking lot, she found her path blocked by a woman in her 30s wearing a Nebraska National Guard uniform. "Excuse me," the woman said, her tone polite but insistent. "Colonel Hayes asked me to find you. She'd like to speak with you privately before the marksmanship demonstrations begin." The request was phrased as an invitation, but Elena recognized the tone of a military order disguised as a social courtesy. Colonel Hayes had not only identified her in the crowd, but had dispatched someone to ensure that Elena didn't leave without speaking with her. Elena's carefully planned anonymous attendance at the Veterans Appreciation Day had lasted exactly 47 minutes before her past began to catch up with her in ways she hadn't anticipated and couldn't control. The private meeting with Colonel Hayes took place in a small office behind the main pavilion, away from the crowds and demonstrations. Elena had followed the National Guard sergeant with growing apprehension, her mind racing through possible explanations for why a retired Marine colonel would specifically seek her out at a public event. The office was spartanly furnished with military efficiency: a metal desk, 2 chairs, and walls decorated with photographs of various military units and commendations. Colonel Hayes was waiting with a manila folder in her hands and an expression that Elena recognized from her own military service, the look of a commanding officer who had done her homework and was prepared to cut through any attempts at evasion. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez," the colonel said, using Elena's former rank deliberately. "Or do you prefer Elena now? I imagine you've gotten quite comfortable with civilian titles after 8 years. Elena remained standing near the door, every instinct telling her to maintain an exit strategy. "I'm not sure what you think you know about me, Colonel, but I'm just a waitress from Millfield who received an invitation to a veterans event. Nothing more complicated than that." Her voice carried the practiced uncertainty she had perfected over years of deflecting questions about her background. But she could see immediately that Colonel Hayes wasn't buying the performance. "Sit down, Sergeant," Hayes said, and the command tone was unmistakable despite the informal setting. "We need to talk about Operation Silent Thunder and why the Marine Corps' most decorated female sniper has been serving coffee in Nebraska instead of training the next generation of warriors." The colonel opened the manila folder and spread several documents across the desk, all bearing official seals and classification markings that made Elena's stomach drop. Elena remained standing, her hands clenched at her sides. "I don't know what operation you're referring to, and I think there's been some mistake. I served my country honorably, completed my enlistment, and chose to pursue civilian life. That's not unusual or suspicious." But even as she spoke, she could see copies of commendations, mission reports, and performance evaluations that she recognized from her own service record. Colonel Hayes studied Elena with the analytical gaze of someone trained to read people under pressure. "The mistake, Sergeant, is thinking that exceptional service comes with an expiration date. The mistake is believing that your country invested 8 years in training you to be one of the most effective snipers in military history, so you could hide in a small town and pretend none of it ever happened. The colonel's voice carried disappointment, rather than anger, which somehow made it worse. "Ma'am, with respect," Elena said, finally sitting down but maintaining rigid posture, "my service record is classified, and discussing operational details with unauthorized personnel would be a violation of my security clearance obligations. Even if I were the person you think I am, this conversation would be inappropriate." It was a deflection tactic, but one based on legitimate security protocols that might give her an honorable way out of the discussion. Hayes smiled grimly and pulled out another document. "Your security clearance was reactivated last month, Sergeant, along with those of 6 other veterans who participated in Operation Silent Thunder. The Pentagon has decided that certain aspects of that mission can now be discussed for recruitment and training purposes. The war you helped end 8 years ago is being declassified piece by piece, and your role in it is about to become public knowledge whether you cooperate or not." Elena felt the room spin slightly as the implications hit her. For 8 years, she had lived with the assumption that her most significant military achievement would remain buried in classified files, that she could maintain her anonymity indefinitely because the government had as much interest in keeping certain operations secret as she did. The possibility that her story might become public had never occurred to her, and she was utterly unprepared for what that might mean. "The shot you made on September 15, 2016, Colonel Hayes continued relentlessly, eliminated Khalil Rahman from a distance of 3,540 meters. That's 2.2 miles, Sergeant. The longest confirmed kill shot in military history, made under conditions that most snipers would consider impossible. You ended a war that had been dragging on for 15 years, brought 50,000 troops home to their families, and saved an estimated 200,000 civilian lives by eliminating the one person who was preventing peace negotiations." Elena's carefully maintained composure began to crack as memories she had spent years suppressing flooded back. The weight of the rifle, the calculations for wind speed and bullet drop over an impossible distance, the pressure of knowing that millions of lives hung in the balance. The moment when everything went silent except for her heartbeat and her breathing, when the entire world narrowed down to the crosshairs of her scope and a target that was barely visible even with the most advanced optics available. "You don't understand," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That shot, the things I had to do to get into position for that shot, the people who died so I could take it. You can't just turn that into a recruitment poster. It's not a story that should be told to inspire young people to join the military. It's a story about what war costs, about what it takes from the people who fight it." Colonel Hayes leaned forward, her expression softening slightly. "Sergeant, what that shot cost you personally doesn't diminish what it accomplished strategically. The fact that you carry the weight of those decisions, that you understand the complexity and the cost, that's exactly why young people need to hear your story. They need to understand that real heroes aren't superhuman. They're people who make impossible choices under unimaginable pressure and live with the consequences." Elena stood up abruptly, pacing to the small window that looked out over the shooting ranges where demonstrations were still taking place. Families with children were watching National Guard personnel explain different types of weapons and their capabilities. Teenagers were asking questions about military careers and training programs. It was exactly the kind of scene that Colonel Hayes was arguing needed Elena's story to complete it. Young people learning about service and sacrifice from someone who had actually lived it. "For 8 years, Elena said, still looking out the window, I've been trying to be normal. I've been trying to prove to myself that I could be more than just a weapon that the military trained and deployed. I've been trying to figure out who Elena Vasquez is when she's not Staff Sergeant Vasquez. And you're telling me that was all pointless because the Pentagon has decided my story needs to be public? Hayes joined Elena at the window, standing beside her as they watched the demonstrations. I'm telling you that you've been hiding from the best part of yourself, Sergeant. You've been so focused on escaping what that shot cost you that you've forgotten what it accomplished. You ended a war. You brought peace to a region that had known nothing but conflict for decades. You saved more lives with one bullet than most people save in a lifetime of service. Elena turned away from the window, facing the colonel directly. And in the process, I became someone who could make that shot. Someone who could calculate the death of another human being from over 2 miles away and execute that calculation without hesitation. Do you understand what that does to a person? Do you understand what it means to know that you're capable of that level of precision? The colonel nodded slowly. I understand that it means you're exactly the kind of person who should be training others, who should be helping them understand both the capabilities and the responsibilities that come with that kind of skill. The military needs instructors who understand the weight of what they're teaching, not just the mechanics of it. Young snipers need to learn from someone who knows what it actually means to take a life in service of something larger than themselves. Elena returned to her chair, suddenly feeling exhausted. What exactly are you asking me to do, Colonel? Because if you think I'm going to stand up in front of a crowd today and talk about Operation Silent Thunder, you're going to be disappointed. I'm not ready for that, and I may never be ready for that. Hayes sat down across from her, closing the manila folder. Today, I'm asking you to watch the marksmanship demonstrations. I'm asking you to see what passes for advanced shooting skills among our current recruits. I'm asking you to consider whether the standards we're setting are adequate for the challenges they're going to face. The colonel paused, studying Elena's face. And I'm asking you to remember that there are young women out there who need to see that someone like them can accomplish extraordinary things. Elena felt trapped between her desire to maintain her anonymity and a growing recognition that her hiding might have been more selfish than protective. And if I'm not ready to go public with my story, if I decide that my service record should remain classified regardless of what the Pentagon thinks about recruitment, Colonel Hayes stood up, gathering her documents. Then you go back to Millfield, Sergeant, and you serve coffee to truckers and pretend that the most significant military achievement of the 21st century never happened. You waste the training that cost taxpayers millions of dollars and the experience that could save lives in future conflicts. You let other people tell the story of women in combat while the woman who actually ended a war remains invisible. The challenge was clear, and Elena recognized it as the kind of tactical pressure that military leaders use to motivate subordinates toward difficult decisions. But she also recognized the truth in Hayes' words. For 8 years, she had been focused entirely on her own need for peace and anonymity, without considering whether her withdrawal from public service might be denying others the benefit of her experience and expertise. The demonstrations start in 30 minutes, Colonel Hayes said, moving toward the door. I've arranged for you to have access to the advanced marksmanship range if you want to observe the current training standards. After that, the decision about your future involvement is entirely yours. But I want you to make that decision based on what you see today, not on what you've been telling yourself for the past 8 years. Elena remained in the office for several minutes after the colonel left, staring at the space where the manila folder had been and trying to process the conversation that had just appended 8 years of carefully constructed anonymity. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the Veterans Appreciation Day continuing, families enjoying demonstrations, young people asking questions about military careers, veterans sharing stories and reconnecting with their service identity. For the first time in 8 years, Elena found herself wondering whether her quest for invisibility had been healing or hiding, whether her determination to be ordinary had been recovery or retreat. The question that Colonel Hayes had posed about young women who needed to see what was possible resonated more deeply than Elena wanted to admit. She had spent so much energy running from her extraordinary past that she had never considered whether that past might be a gift rather than a burden. Elena made her way to the advanced marksmanship range with reluctant steps, still processing her conversation with Colonel Hayes. The range was situated away from the main demonstration areas, designed for serious shooters rather than public entertainment. As she approached, she could hear the distinctive crack of high-powered rifles and see a small group of people clustered around the firing line, watching what appeared to be a competitive shooting demonstration. The first familiar face she encountered made her stomach sink with recognition. Marcus Webb, a former Army Ranger who now ran a tactical training company in Omaha, was holding court near the equipment tables, explaining the finer points of long range shooting to a mixed group of active military personnel and civilian enthusiasts. Elena had met Marcus briefly at a joint service training exercise 6 years earlier, before her discharge, and hoped desperately that he wouldn't recognize her after so much time and her deliberate transformation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus was saying in the confident tone of someone accustomed to being the expert in any group, "what you're about to see represents the current state of the art in military marksmanship training. Our best snipers can consistently hit targets at 800 meters, with exceptional shooters occasionally making successful shots out to 1,200 meters under ideal conditions." He gestured toward the range, where several targets were set up at various distances. Elena positioned herself at the back of the group, hoping to observe without being noticed, but her plan was immediately complicated by the arrival of several other people she recognized from her time in service. There was Captain Sarah Morrison, who had been a lieutenant during Elena's final deployment and was now apparently involved in training programs. There was Sergeant First Class David Kim, who had served with distinction in Afghanistan and was now working as a civilian contractor for the Defense Department. The presence of so many people from her military past made Elena's anonymity feel increasingly fragile. She had assumed that 8 years would be enough time for her to fade from the memory of casual acquaintances, that her deliberate transformation would make recognition unlikely. But as she watched the group dynamics, she realized that the military community was smaller and had longer memories than she had anticipated. Captain Morrison was explaining the challenges of long-range shooting to a group of high school students who had been brought to the event as part of a recruitment outreach program. "The difficulty increases exponentially with distance," she said, pointing to targets set up at various ranges. "At 400 meters you're dealing with wind drift and bullet drop, but the calculations are manageable. At 800 meters you have to account for temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, even the rotation of the Earth. Very few shooters can make consistent hits beyond that range." Elena found herself mentally correcting the captain's explanations, noting oversimplifications and inaccuracies that might mislead the students about the true capabilities of advanced marksmanship. The 800-meter limitation that Morrison described as exceptional was barely beyond intermediate level for someone with proper training and equipment. Elena had regularly made shots at twice that distance during training exercises, and her operational shots had often exceeded 2,000 meters. Marcus Webb stepped forward to demonstrate what he described as advanced long-range techniques, taking position behind a precision rifle set up on a bipod. The target was placed at 600 meters, and Marcus made a show of checking wind conditions, adjusting his scope, and explaining his calculations to the watching crowd. Elena could see immediately that his form was competent, but not exceptional. His calculations approximate rather than precise. "This represents the outer edge of practical military sniping," Marcus announced as he prepared to take his shot. "Beyond this distance, factors become too unpredictable for reliable engagement." He fired, hitting the target in the outer rings rather than the center, and received appreciative applause from the crowd. Elena had to suppress the urge to point out that his shot would have been considered inadequate for graduation from advanced sniper school. The demonstration continued with several other shooters taking turns at the 600-meter target, with mixed results that were consistently praised as exceptional by the observers. Elena watched with growing frustration as technique that she would have considered basic was presented as advanced, as limitations that existed primarily in training and mindset were described as physical impossibilities. One of the high school students, a young woman who appeared genuinely interested in the technical aspects of marksmanship, asked about the theoretical limits of rifle accuracy. "What's the longest successful shot anyone has ever made?" she asked, her curiosity evident in her voice and posture. Marcus Webb exchanged glances with Captain Morrison before answering. "Well, there are some classified operations where longer shots may have been attempted," he said carefully. "But in terms of confirmed, documented kills, the current record stands at about 1,500 meters. That shot was made by a Canadian sniper in Afghanistan under nearly perfect conditions. Anything beyond that range is basically impossible with current technology." Elena felt her hands clench involuntarily as she listened to Marcus casually dismiss achievements that she knew were not only possible, but had been accomplished multiple times by various snipers. The 1,500-meter record he cited had been broken several times since then, and his claim about the limits of current technology was simply wrong. She had personally made shots at distances that would have shattered his understanding of what was possible. The young woman pressed further, clearly fascinated by the subject. "But what about in movies, where snipers make shots from like 2 miles away? Is that just Hollywood nonsense?" Her question drew chuckles from several of the adults, who seemed to find her naivety amusing rather than her curiosity admirable. "Pure Hollywood fantasy," Marcus replied with the condescending tone of someone explaining simple facts to a child. "The physics simply don't work beyond about 1,000 meters for reliable accuracy. Air resistance, wind drift, bullet drop, all these factors compound to make longer shots essentially random chance rather than skill." He gestured dismissively. "Anyone who claims to have made a shot beyond 2,000 meters is either lying or got extremely lucky." Elena felt her composure slipping as she listened to Marcus definitively state that achievements she had actually accomplished were impossible. The casual dismissal of capabilities that had required years of training and had been executed under life-or-death conditions struck her as both insulting and dangerous. Young people considering military careers were being given fundamentally incorrect information about the possibilities within their chosen field. Sergeant Kim added his voice to the discussion, apparently eager to share his expertise. "I've worked with some of the best snipers in the military," he said, "and I can tell you that even our most elite shooters struggle with consistency beyond 800 meters. The idea of someone making a reliable shot at 2 miles is just not realistic with human limitations and current equipment." The conversation continued in this vein, with various supposed experts explaining why certain achievements were impossible, why current training standards represented the practical limits of human capability, and why young people should have realistic expectations about what could be accomplished in military service. Elena found herself growing increasingly angry, not just at the misinformation being presented, but at the way it was being used to limit the aspirations of the very people the military was trying to recruit. Captain Morrison noticed Elena standing at the back of the group and apparently mistook her expression of frustration for confusion about the technical discussion. "Ma'am, I hope we're not getting too technical for you," she said with well-meaning condescension. "Long-range shooting can be pretty complicated if you're not familiar with the physics involved." Elena forced a smile and shook her head. "Not at all, Captain. I find it fascinating. I was just wondering about your statement regarding the impossibility of shots beyond 2,000 meters. Have there really been no documented cases of successful engagements at longer ranges?" Her question was carefully phrased to sound like civilian curiosity rather than professional challenge. Marcus Webb stepped in to answer, clearly relishing the opportunity to educate what he perceived as an uninformed civilian. Ma'am, I understand that movies and video games might give the impression that such shots are possible. But in reality, the technical challenges are insurmountable. Even if someone claimed to have made such a shot, verification would be nearly impossible, and the conditions would have to be so perfect that it couldn't be replicated. Elena felt a familiar coldness settling over her, the same focused calm that had preceded her most difficult shots during active service. So you're saying that if someone had made such a shot, you wouldn't believe it even with proper documentation? She asked, her voice carefully neutral. Without seeing it myself, under controlled conditions, I'd have to assume it was either fabricated or a lucky accident, Marcus replied confidently. The mathematics simply don't support consistent accuracy at those ranges with handheld weapons. Anyone who claims otherwise is either delusional or trying to sell something. Sergeant Kim nodded in agreement. I've seen guys come back from deployment with all kinds of tall tales about impossible shots and miraculous accuracy. Usually, when you dig into the details, the stories fall apart. Combat stress can make people remember things differently than they actually happened. Elena realized that she was listening to a systematic dismissal of not just her own achievements, but those of other snipers who had pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible. The casual assumption that extraordinary performance was either impossible or fabricated struck her as deeply unfair to the men and women who had dedicated their careers to exceeding supposed limitations. The high school student who had asked the original question looked disappointed by the expert's responses. So basically, if I wanted to be a sniper, I shouldn't expect to ever make the kind of shots you see in movies? She asked, her enthusiasm visibly deflated. That's exactly right, Captain Morrison said with what she probably thought was helpful realism. Military sniping is about consistent, reliable performance at moderate ranges under various conditions. It's important work, but it's not the superhuman marksmanship that popular culture portrays. Elena watched the young woman's expression shift from excitement to resignation and felt something inside herself snap. For 8 years, she had remained silent about her achievements, had allowed her story to remain classified and her capabilities to go unrecognized. She had told herself that this silence was necessary for her own peace of mind, that sharing her experiences would only bring unwanted attention and painful memories. But watching these supposed experts crush the aspirations of young people with their limited understanding of what was actually possible, Elena realized that her silence might be doing more harm than she had ever considered. The young woman who had asked about long-range shooting deserved to know that the limitations being described to her were artificial, that with proper training and dedication, achievements far beyond the expert's imagination were not only possible, but had been accomplished multiple times. As the demonstration continued with more mediocre shooting being praised as exceptional performance, Elena found herself remembering Colonel Hayes' words about young women who needed to see what was possible. She began to understand that her 8 years of hiding hadn't just been about protecting herself. It had been about depriving others of knowledge and inspiration that might change their lives in profound ways. The arrival of the local media crew marked the moment when Elena's quiet observation became impossible to maintain. Channel 7 News from Grand Island had sent a reporter and cameraman to cover the Veterans Appreciation Day, and they immediately gravitated toward the Marksmanship demonstration as the most visually interesting story of the event. Elena found herself trapped in the growing crowd as the news crew began setting up their equipment and interviewing the supposed experts. Reporter Janet Stevens, a woman in her 40s with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of aggressive enthusiasm that characterized local television news, began her segment by interviewing Marcus Webb about the demonstration. So Marcus, what we're seeing here today represents the absolute pinnacle of military marksmanship training, she asked, holding her microphone with practiced precision. Marcus preened under the attention, straightening his shoulders and adopting the authoritative tone he had been using with the civilian observers. That's exactly right, Janet. What you're witnessing here today is the kind of precision shooting that protects our troops overseas and keeps America safe. These 600-meter shots represent the cutting edge of what's possible in real-world military applications. Elena felt her jaw clench as she watched Marcus transform his mediocre shooting performance into a narrative about elite military capabilities. The reporter was clearly buying into his presentation, nodding appreciatively and asking follow-up questions that allowed him to further exaggerate both the difficulty of what he had accomplished and its significance in military operations. "Now, Marcus," Janet continued, "I'm sure our viewers are curious about those Hollywood movies where snipers make impossible shots from miles away. Can you set the record straight about what's really possible versus what's just movie magic?" Her question was posed with the kind of knowing smile that suggested she was giving Marcus an opportunity to debunk popular misconceptions. "Well, Janet," Marcus replied, clearly relishing his role as the voice of military expertise, "I hate to disappoint action movie fans, but those 2-mile shots you see in films are pure fantasy. The laws of physics simply don't allow for that kind of accuracy at extreme distances. Even our most elite military snipers are limited to about 1,000 meters for reliable accuracy, and anything beyond that is basically a prayer and a hope." Camera panned across the demonstration area as Marcus spoke, capturing images of the targets at 600 meters and the various rifles set up on the shooting line. Elena realized with growing horror that this segment would likely be broadcast throughout central Nebraska, spreading Marcus's fundamental misunderstandings about military capabilities to thousands of viewers who would accept his claims as authoritative. "Truth." Captain Morrison stepped into frame, apparently eager to share the spotlight. "What Marcus is saying is absolutely correct," she added. "As someone who has served in combat zones, I can tell you that real military sniping is about consistent performance under difficult conditions, not the superhuman marksmanship you see in entertainment. We train our people to be realistic about what's achievable." Elena watched as the two supposed experts continued to reinforce each other's limited understanding, creating a narrative that portrayed current training standards as the absolute ceiling of human capability rather than a baseline for competent performance. Their casual dismissal of achievements that had actually been accomplished multiple times struck her as both professionally irresponsible and personally insulting. The reporter turned to address the crowd directly, seeking additional perspectives for her story. "Are there any other military veterans here today who would like to comment on the realities of military marksmanship versus Hollywood portrayals?" she asked, scanning the faces around her with the practiced eye of someone looking for good television. Several people stepped forward to offer their opinions, most echoing the themes that Marcus and Captain Morrison had established. A retired Army sergeant talked about the importance of teamwork over individual heroics. A National Guard recruiter emphasized the comprehensive nature of military training beyond just shooting skills. Each comment reinforced the narrative that extraordinary individual achievement was less important than steady, reliable performance. Elena found herself in the uncomfortable position of wanting to correct the record, while simultaneously wanting to remain invisible. The misinformation being broadcast was genuinely harmful to young people considering military careers, but speaking up would expose her to exactly the kind of attention she had spent 8 years avoiding. She stood at the back of the crowd, torn between her desire for anonymity and her growing frustration with the experts' limitations. The situation became more complicated when the high school student who had asked earlier questions about long-range shooting approached the reporter during a brief break in filming. "Excuse me," the young woman said, "but I'm still confused about whether really long shots are possible. Some of these people are saying it's impossible, but I've read articles online about snipers making shots at over a mile. Are those articles wrong?" Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Janet Stevens, saw an opportunity for good television and gestured for her cameraman to resume filming. "That's an excellent question," she said, turning back to Marcus. "Webb, Marcus, this young lady brings up an interesting point. Are there conflicting reports about the capabilities of military snipers, and how do we separate fact from fiction?" Marcus stepped forward with the confidence of someone who believed. His own expertise was unquestionable. "Young lady," he said in a tone that managed to be both condescending and authoritative, "the internet is full of misinformation about military capabilities. These stories about mile-plus shots are either completely fabricated, grossly exaggerated, or describing lucky accidents that couldn't be repeated under controlled conditions." Elena felt her hands clench as she watched Marcus dismiss documented achievements with casual certainty. The young woman's question had been intelligent and well-informed, based on actual military records that had been declassified and reported in reputable publications. Marcus's response wasn't just wrong. It was an insult to the snipers who had actually accomplished what he claimed was impossible. Sergeant Kim joined the conversation, adding his voice to what was becoming a chorus of supposed expertise. "I've worked with special operations units," he said, "and I can tell you that even our most elite snipers know better than to attempt shots beyond their proven capabilities. The idea that someone could reliably hit a target at 2 miles is not just unlikely, it's militarily useless because the conditions required would never exist in real combat." Elena's frustration reached a breaking point as she listened to Kim describe as militarily useless the exact type of shot that had ended a 15-year war and saved hundreds of thousands of lives. His casual dismissal of capabilities that had been developed through years of training and proven under the most extreme conditions imaginable represented everything that was wrong with the current approach to military training and recruitment. The reporter, sensing that she had stumbled onto an interesting angle for her story, pressed further. "So you're saying that despite what people might read online or see in declassified military documents, these extreme-range shots are essentially," she asked, clearly hoping for definitive statements that would make for compelling television. "That's exactly what we're saying," Marcus replied with absolute confidence. "Any claims about shots beyond 1,500 meters should be viewed with extreme skepticism. The technology doesn't exist, the training doesn't exist, and the tactical situations that would require such shots don't exist in real military operations." Elena realized that she was witnessing the creation of a news segment that would actively discourage young people from pursuing advanced military training by convincing them that extraordinary achievement was impossible. The combination of media attention and supposed expert testimony would give Marcus's limitations the weight of official truth, potentially influencing recruitment and training decisions throughout the region. The young woman who had asked the original question looked increasingly confused and disappointed as the experts continued to dismiss the achievements she had read about. Elena could see her enthusiasm for military service deflating in real time as she was told that the capabilities that had inspired her interest were fictional. The sight of a bright, curious young person being discouraged by adults who simply didn't understand the true scope of military capabilities was more than Elena could bear. As the camera continued rolling, and the experts continued explaining why extraordinary marksmanship was impossible, Elena found herself remembering Colonel Hayes's words about young women who needed to see what was possible. She thought about the teenagers who would watch this new segment and conclude that military service offered no opportunities for exceptional achievement, no chance to exceed ordinary limitations. For the first time in 8 years, Elena's desire to remain invisible came into direct conflict with her sense of responsibility to the truth and to the young people who deserved to know what was actually possible with dedication and proper training. The breaking point came when Marcus Webb made a statement that Elena simply could not let stand unchallenged. As the news camera rolled and the crowd of observers listened intently, he declared with absolute certainty, I want to be crystal clear about this. No human being has ever made a confirmed kill shot beyond 2,000 meters. It's physically impossible with current weapons technology, and anyone claiming otherwise is either lying or delusional. Elena felt something cold and familiar settle in her chest, the same focused calm that had preceded her most challenging shots in Afghanistan. She had spent 8 years telling herself that her silence was necessary, that revealing her capabilities would only bring unwanted complications to her carefully constructed quiet life. But watching Marcus destroy the aspirations of young people with his ignorant certainty, she realized that some truths were too important to keep hidden. Actually, Elena said, her voice cutting through the chatter with unexpected authority, that's not accurate. Every head in the crowd turned toward her, including the news camera, which swiveled to capture this unexpected contradiction to the established expert narrative. Elena found herself suddenly the center of attention she had spent years avoiding, but her commitment to correcting the dangerous misinformation overrode her personal preferences. Marcus Webb's face flushed with irritation at being challenged by what he perceived as a civilian amateur. Ma'am, I appreciate your interest in the subject, but this is a technical discussion about military capabilities. Unless you have actual experience with long-range shooting, you might want to let the experts handle the facts. His tone carried the dismissive confidence of someone who had never been seriously challenged on his supposed area of expertise. Elena met his gaze steadily, feeling the familiar weight of years of training and experience behind her words. The current confirmed long-range elimination record is 3,540 meters, achieved in Afghanistan in September 2016. The shot was made with a Chetak M200 intervention rifle using .408 caliber ammunition, under conditions that included 15-knot crosswinds and temperatures exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Her voice carried the precision of someone reciting facts rather than claims, technical details that no civilian would know without direct involvement. The crowd fell silent as Elena's statement hung in the air, its specificity and technical accuracy creating an uncomfortable tension with Marcus's absolute denials. Captain Morrison stepped forward, her expression skeptical but less dismissive than Marcus's. Ma'am, where exactly did you get those very specific details? Because if such a shot had been made, it would be classified information, not something available to civilian researchers. Elena realized that she had already crossed a line from which there was no retreat. The technical details she had provided could only have come from someone with direct access to classified operational reports. Someone who had either been present for the shot or involved in the mission planning. Her attempt to correct the misinformation had inadvertently revealed more about her background than she had intended. You're absolutely right, Captain, Elena said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that made several people in the crowd lean forward to hear better. It would be classified information. Or at least it was classified until last month, when certain aspects of Operation Silent Thunder were declassified for training and recruitment purposes. She paused, looking directly at Marcus Webb. I know these details because I was the shooter. The silence that followed Elena's revelation was profound and uncomfortable. Marcus Webb's expression shifted from irritation to confusion to something approaching shock as he processed the implications of what she had just claimed. Captain Morrison's skeptical expression transformed into something more complex, a mixture of disbelief and growing recognition that the woman standing before them might not be who any of them had assumed. Reporter Janet Stevens, recognizing that her routine story about veteran appreciation had suddenly become something much more significant, gestured frantically for her cameraman to ensure he was capturing everything. Ma'am, she said, her professional composure barely containing her excitement. Are you claiming that you personally made the longest confirmed sniper shot in military history? Elena nodded once, a simple acknowledgement that carried the weight of 8 years of hidden truth. Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez, 3rd Marine Raider Battalion, The shot was taken from a concealed position in the Kandahar province to eliminate a high-value target whose death ended active hostilities and enabled the peace negotiations that brought our troops home. Her military bearing became more evident as she spoke, her posture straightening and her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to delivering briefings on life and death matters. Marcus Webb's face had gone pale as the implications of Elena's claim sank in. If she was telling the truth, then everything he had just stated with absolute confidence was not only wrong but embarrassingly so. His dismissal of capabilities that she had actually demonstrated made him look not just ignorant, but foolishly arrogant. That's impossible," he stammered, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "You're just ... you can't be." "Sergeant." Kim stepped forward, his expression more analytical than dismissive. "Ma'am, with all due respect, those are some very serious claims you're making. Staff Sergeant Vasquez's identity and service record would be classified information, and impersonating military personnel is a federal crime. Can you provide any verification of these claims?" Elena reached into her jacket and pulled out a worn military identification card that she had carried for 8 years, but never expected to show to anyone. She handed it to Sergeant Kim, who examined it carefully before passing it to Captain Morrison. The authenticity of the identification was immediately apparent to anyone with military experience. The formatting, the security features, the wear patterns, all consistent with genuine military credentials. Captain Morrison studied the identification card with growing amazement before looking up at Elena with new respect. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez," she said, using Elena's rank for the first time, "your service record. Operation Silent Thunder. We studied that mission in advanced sniper school. The tactical planning, the execution, the strategic impact. It's considered one of the most significant individual achievements in modern military history." The crowd of observers was processing this revelation with varying degrees of shock and disbelief. The high school student who had asked the original questions about long-range shooting looked stunned, her eyes wide as she realized that the person who had answered her question was not just knowledgeable about the subject, but had literally made history in the field. Several of the other veterans in the crowd were checking their phones, apparently searching for information about Operation Silent Thunder and Elena's role in it. Marcus Webb was struggling to maintain his composure as his position as the event's supposed expert on marksmanship crumbled around him. "Even if you are who you claim to be," he said desperately, "one lucky shot doesn't make you an expert on the limits of human capability. Extreme conditions, perfect weather, advanced equipment. Anyone could have made that shot under those circumstances." Elena's expression hardened at Marcus's attempt to diminish her achievement through ignorance of what the mission had actually required. "Mr. Webb," she said, her voice carrying the cold precision that had once made enemy commanders afraid to show themselves, "the shot was made after 72 hours without sleep, using borrowed equipment that had been damaged during insertion, in a sandstorm that reduced visibility to less than 50 meters for most of the approach. The target was moving, the wind was gusting unpredictably, and failure would have meant the continuation of a war that had already claimed over 100,000 lives." The technical details Elena provided painted a picture of a shot made under conditions that would have challenged even the most advanced snipers, conditions that made Marcus's suggestion of anyone could have done it seem not just wrong but absurdly naive. Her calm recitation of the challenges she had overcome demonstrated a level of professional capability that went far beyond anything the supposed experts had imagined possible. Captain Morrison was shaking her head in amazement as she continued to process Elena's identity. "Staff Sergeant, I have to ask, what are you doing here? Why are you working as a civilian when the military could use your experience for training advanced snipers? Your knowledge and capabilities could revolutionize our marksmanship programs." Elena's expression softened slightly as she considered. How to answer the captain's question without revealing the full complexity of her reasons for leaving military service. Sometimes, Captain, the cost of using certain capabilities becomes higher than the value of the capabilities themselves. I served my country when it needed me to take that shot. Now I serve it by living a quiet life and trying to heal from what that service required. The news reporter, recognizing that she had stumbled onto one of the biggest stories of her career, pressed forward with more questions, but Alina was already beginning to retreat from the attention she had never wanted. Her moment of truth-telling had accomplished its immediate purpose, correcting the dangerous misinformation and showing the young people present what was actually possible with dedication and training. But it had also shattered the anonymity she had spent 8 years building, and she could see no way to put that particular revelation back in its box. The immediate aftermath of Elena's revelation created a ripple effect that spread beyond the small crowd at the Marksmanship demonstration. Word traveled quickly through the Veterans Appreciation Day event that the woman who had ended the longest war in American history was present, and people began gravitating toward the advanced range with a mixture of curiosity, disbelief, and genuine respect for her service. Colonel Hayes appeared at Elena's shoulder within minutes of her public identification, having been alerted by the buzz of activity and the sight of the news crew focusing intently on someone other than the scheduled speakers. "Staff Sergeant," she said quietly, "I see you've decided to stop hiding." Her tone carried no judgment, only a recognition that Elena had crossed a threshold from which there would be no return to anonymity. Elena turned to face the colonel, her expression a mixture of resignation and something that might have been relief. "It seemed more important to correct the record than to protect my privacy, ma'am. These young people deserve to know what's actually possible, not to have their aspirations limited by someone else's ignorance." She glanced back at the crowd, which had grown to include dozens of people who were still processing the revelation that a living legend had been standing among them unrecognized. The high school student who had asked the original questions about long-range shooting approached Elena with obvious awe and excitement. "Ma'am, Staff Sergeant, I can't believe you're actually here. I've been researching military careers, and I read everything I could find about Operation Silent Thunder after it was partially declassified. You saved so many lives with that one shot." Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Elena found herself remembering why she had originally chosen to serve. "What's your name?" Elena asked, her voice gentler than it had been during her confrontation with Marcus Webb. "Jessica Martinez, ma'am. I'm a senior at Hastings High School, and I've been thinking about joining the Marines after graduation. But after listening to these experts today, I was starting to think that maybe I wasn't cut out for advanced military training." Jessica's honesty about her wavering confidence made Elena realize how much damage Marcus's misinformation could have caused. Elena studied Jessica's face, seeing in her the kind of intelligence and determination that she recognized from her own early military service. "Jessica, what these people told you today about limitations and impossibility, most of that was based on their own boundaries, not on actual human potential. With proper training, dedication, and the right mindset, capabilities that seem impossible can become routine. The military needs people who refuse to accept artificial limitations." Jessica's face lit up with renewed enthusiasm. "Would it be possible for you to show us what advanced marksmanship actually looks like? Everyone keeps saying that shots beyond 1,000 meters are impossible, but you made one at over 2 miles. Could you demonstrate what proper technique looks like?" The request created an immediate stir among the gathered crowd. Several people began voicing support for the idea, curious to see whether Elena could actually demonstrate the capabilities she claimed. Others, particularly Marcus Webb and his supporters, seemed skeptical that anyone could perform at the level Elena described, especially after 8 years away from active service. Colonel Hayes stepped forward, recognizing both the opportunity and the risks involved in such a demonstration. Staff Sergeant, I have to point out that demonstrating your capabilities in front of news cameras would make your anonymity permanently impossible. This story would go national, and your quiet life in Millfield would be over forever. Her warning was delivered with the gravity of someone who understood the implications. Elena looked around at the faces surrounding her. Young people whose aspirations had been nearly crushed by ignorant limitations. Veterans who deserved to know what their service could accomplish. And supposed experts whose misinformation was actively harmful to military recruitment and training. The choice between her personal privacy and the responsibility to truth seemed clear, even though the consequences would be permanent. Colonel, Elena said, her voice carrying the decision she had already made. 8 years ago, I made a shot. That ended a war because it was the right thing to do, regardless of the personal cost. Today, it seems like the right thing to do is to show these young people what's actually possible when you refuse to accept other people's limitations. She paused, looking directly at Jessica Martinez. Sometimes the most important service you can perform is to prove that extraordinary things are achievable. The crowd erupted in excited conversation as Alana's decision became clear. Colonel Hayes immediately began coordinating with the range safety officers to set up targets at extreme distances, while several veterans with technical expertise began discussing the equipment requirements for a demonstration at ranges far beyond what the facility had originally planned. Marcus Webb, realizing that his credibility was about to be completely destroyed by Alana's demonstration, made one last desperate attempt to discredit her claims. Look, even if you are who you say you are, combat shooting and range shooting are completely different. Just because you got lucky once in Afghanistan doesn't mean you can perform under controlled conditions. The pressure, the adrenaline, the life or death stakes, without those factors, you probably can't replicate what happened during the war. Elena's expression hardened as she listened to Marcus's attempt to diminish her service by calling it luck and suggesting that she needed life or death pressure to perform at her actual capability level. His fundamental misunderstanding of what professional military training accomplished, the development of skills that worked better under pressure, not worse, revealed the depth of his ignorance about elite military capabilities. Mr. Webb, Elena said, her voice carrying the cold precision that had once made enemy commanders afraid to show themselves. Professional military training is designed to make performance more reliable under pressure, not less. A properly trained sniper performs better when lives are at stake, not worse. The controlled conditions you're describing should make accurate shooting easier, not more difficult. Captain Morrison, who had been watching the exchange with growing fascination, stepped forward to address the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we're about to witness something unprecedented. If Staff Sergeant Vasquez can demonstrate even a fraction of the capability she displayed during Operation Silent Thunder, we're looking at a complete redefinition of what we consider possible in military marksmanship. The news reporter, Janet Stevens, was barely containing her excitement as she realized that her routine human interest story had evolved into potentially the biggest news event of her career. She positioned herself with her cameraman to capture whatever demonstration Elena was about to provide, while simultaneously trying to contact her news director to ensure that additional resources would be available if the story warranted extended coverage. Sergeant Kim, who had been more respectful than Marcus in his skepticism, approached Elena with genuine curiosity. Staff Sergeant, if you don't mind me asking, what kind of range are you thinking about for this demonstration? The facility here is set up for conventional distances, but based on your service record, I imagine you're used to working at ranges that are well beyond what we have available. Elena surveyed the shooting range, noting its limitations and considering what would be both achievable and convincing to the gathered observers. The longest clear line of sight here appears to be about 1,200 meters to that ridgeline, she said, pointing to a distant hill that was barely visible to most of the observers. That's well short of what Operation Silent Thunder required, but it should be sufficient to demonstrate that the capabilities these people claim are impossible are actually quite routine with proper training. The murmur that went through the crowd at Elena's casual description of a 1,200-meter shot as routine revealed how completely her perspective differed from that of the supposed experts who had been holding court earlier. What they had described as the absolute limits of human capability, she was treating as a basic demonstration suitable for public education. Colonel Hayes finished her coordination with the range safety officers and returned to Elena's side. Staff Sergeant, we have targets available, and the range is cleared for extended distances. The wind conditions are challenging but manageable, and we have spotting equipment available if you need it. Her tone carried the professional respect of one elite military professional addressing another. Elena nodded once, already beginning the mental calculations that had once been as natural as breathing. Thank you, Colonel. I think it's time these young people learned what's actually possible when you refuse to accept artificial limitations. Elena approached the rifle that had been set up for the demonstration with the calm, methodical precision of someone for whom weapons were tools rather than objects of fascination. The crowd had grown to nearly 200 people as word spread throughout the Veterans Appreciation Day event that something extraordinary was about to happen. The weapon was a precision rifle similar to what she had used during her service, though not identical to the custom configuration she had employed during Operation Silent Thunder. She began her preparation with a systematic inspection of the equipment, checking the rifle's condition, examining the scope, and testing the bipod stability. Her movements were economical and professional, each action serving a specific purpose in ensuring optimal performance. The crowd watched in fascination as Elena transformed from a quiet woman in civilian clothes into something recognizably military. Her posture, her focus, her systematic approach to the task, all revealing the professional warrior beneath the carefully constructed ordinary exterior. The target is positioned at 1,247 meters, announced the range safety officer, his voice carrying over the loudspeaker system. Wind conditions are variable, gusting from the southwest at 8 to 15 knots. Temperature is 73 degrees Fahrenheit. Barometric pressure is 30.15 inches of mercury. The technical details meant little to most of the civilian observers, but the veterans in the crowd recognized them as the environmental factors that would need to be calculated and compensated for in any long-range shot. Elena settled into position behind the rifle, her body automatically adopting the stance that had been drilled into her through thousands of hours of training. She adjusted the bipod legs with minute precision, ensuring that the weapon was perfectly stable and aligned. Her breathing became controlled and rhythmic, a pattern designed to minimize movement and provide consistent timing for the shot. The transformation was remarkable. The woman who had seemed uncertain and defensive during her earlier interactions now radiated complete confidence and professional competence. Marcus Webb, still desperately hoping to salvage some credibility from the situation, called out from the crowd, "Remember, everyone, this is just one shot under ideal conditions. Even if she hits the target, it doesn't prove that consistent accuracy is possible at these ranges. One successful shot could still be luck rather than skill." His voice carried a note of desperation that was apparent to everyone listening, but his attempt to hedge against Elena's success revealed his continued inability to grasp the level of capability he was about to witness. Elena ignored Marcus's commentary, focusing instead on the technical aspects of the shot. She made minute adjustments to her scope, calculating for the wind conditions, bullet drop, and atmospheric factors that would affect the projectile's flight over the 1,247-meter distance. Her calculations were performed with the automatic precision of someone for whom such computations had become second nature. Muscle memory developed through years of training and operational experience. The crowd fell silent as Elena settled into her final shooting position. Even people who knew nothing about marksmanship could sense the focused intensity that surrounded her, the complete concentration that comes from years of training and life-or-death experience. The noise of the surrounding Veterans Day activities seemed to fade as everyone present focused on the woman behind the rifle and the distant target that was barely visible even with binoculars. Elena's breathing slowed to the precise rhythm that would provide the stability needed for the shot. Her finger found the trigger with the gentle touch of someone who understood that the difference between success and failure often came down to the most minute details of technique. The world narrowed to the view through her scope, the crosshairs, the distant target, and the calculations that would determine whether the bullet would find its mark across more than 3/4 of a mile. The shot, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. A single crack of the rifle, followed by silence as the bullet traveled downrange at over 3,000 feet per second. The crowd held its collective breath as spotters with high-powered optics focused on the distant target, waiting for confirmation of what had happened. The seconds seemed to stretch as everyone waited for news from the spotting team. "Perfect center hit," came the announcement from the range safety officer, his voice betraying his amazement even through the professional calm he was trying to maintain. "Dead center of the target at 1,247 meters. Textbook precision shot." The confirmation sent a ripple of amazement through the crowd, followed by spontaneous applause that grew louder as people processed what they had just witnessed. Elena rose from her shooting position with the same methodical precision she had shown throughout the demonstration. She cleared the rifle, ensuring it was safe, and stepped back from the firing line with no apparent excitement or celebration. To her, the successful shot was simply confirmation that her training and experience remained intact after 8 years of civilian life. To everyone else, it was proof that human capabilities extended far beyond what they had been told was possible. Jessica Martinez was among the first to reach Elena after the shot, her face glowing with excitement and renewed determination. "That was incredible. You made it look so easy, like it was just routine for you." Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Elena found herself smiling for the first time since her identity had been revealed. "Jessica," Elena said, "it is routine with proper training. That's what I want you to understand. The limitations these people were describing to you earlier aren't real limitations. They're just the boundaries of their own experience and training. With dedication and the right instruction, capabilities that seem impossible can become standard operating procedure." Colonel Hayes approached Elena with an expression of professional admiration mixed with something approaching awe. "Staff Sergeant, that was textbook execution under pressure, in front of cameras and critics. Your skills haven't diminished at all during your time in civilian life. The military needs instructors who can demonstrate that level of capability and help others achieve it." The news reporter, Janet Stevens, was practically vibrating with excitement as she realized that she had just captured footage of what might be the most remarkable display of marksmanship ever recorded for television. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez," she said, "our viewers are going to be amazed by what they just saw. Can you explain to them what just happened here? How is it possible to hit a target accurately at that distance?" Elena considered the question carefully, recognizing that her answer would likely be broadcast to thousands of people and could influence how military capabilities were understood by the general public. "What happened here is the result of proper training, consistent practice, and refusing to accept artificial limitations. The shot I just made would be considered routine by any properly trained military sniper. The idea that such capabilities are impossible or exceptional is simply wrong." Marcus Webb stood at the edge of the crowd, his face pale and his earlier confidence completely shattered. The demonstration had not only proven that his claims about impossibility were wrong, but had done so in such a definitive way that his credibility as an expert was permanently destroyed. Several people who had been listening to his earlier presentations were now looking at him with expressions ranging from disappointment to anger at having been misled. Captain Morrison was shaking her head in amazement as she processed what she had witnessed. Staff Sergeant, I have to ask, if this level of capability is routine for properly trained snipers, why aren't we teaching it more widely? Why are our current training standards so much lower than what you just demonstrated? Elena's expression grew serious as she considered the captain's question. That, Captain, is exactly the problem that needs to be addressed. Military training has become focused on meeting minimum standards rather than developing maximum capabilities. Young people like Jessica are being told that extraordinary performance is impossible when what they really need is training that helps them achieve their full potential. The crowd began to disperse as people processed what they had witnessed. But many lingered to ask Elena questions about military service, advanced training, and the possibilities that had been opened by her demonstration. The quiet woman who had been serving coffee in a Nebraska diner 12 hours earlier had become the center of a conversation about human potential and military capability that would extend far beyond the Veterans Appreciation Day event. As Elena answered questions and spoke with young people who were now reconsidering their assumptions about what they might achieve in military service, she realized that her 8 years of hiding had officially come to an end. There would be no returning to anonymity after what had just happened. No going back to the invisible life she had built in Millfield. But for the first time since leaving the military, she felt that the sacrifice of her privacy might be worth the impact she could have on the next generation of service members. The consequences of Elena's demonstration began unfolding within hours of the video hitting social media. By evening, footage of her impossible shot had been shared thousands of times across multiple platforms, with hashtags like #RealSniper and #HiddenHero trending nationwide. The story had grown beyond regional news into a viral phenomenon that attracted attention from major media outlets, military recruitment offices, and veterans organizations across the country. Marcus Webb was among the first to face the fallout from his public humiliation. His tactical training company's social media accounts were flooded with comments questioning his expertise and demanding refunds from students who felt they had been misled about the true possibilities of advanced marksmanship. Several corporate sponsors pulled their support after watching the video of him dismissing as impossible the very capabilities that Elena had demonstrated with casual precision. His online reputation, carefully built over years of self-promotion, crumbled in the cold space of a single afternoon. Webb's attempts to salvage his credibility through hastily posted videos only made the situation worse. His claims that Elena's shot was a fluke, that the conditions were artificially ideal, and that combat shooting was fundamentally different from range demonstrations were met with ridicule from viewers who had witnessed the professionalism and systematic precision of her performance. Military veterans who had previously respected his instruction began publicly questioning whether his training methods were adequate for modern threats. Captain Morrison found herself in a more complicated position. Unlike Marcus, she had shown genuine respect for Elena's capabilities once they were revealed, but her earlier statements about the limitations of military marksmanship had also been broadcast and shared online. The Defense Department's social media monitoring team flagged the footage within hours, leading to questions from her superiors about why current training standards seemed so far below what Elena had demonstrated as routine capability. The phone call from her commanding officer came that evening. Captain, I've been watching footage of today's demonstration in Nebraska. Can you explain to me why you were on camera stating that shots beyond 800 meters are essentially impossible when we apparently have veterans who can consistently hit targets at over 1,200 meters? The question was delivered in the tone that military officers recognize as a prelude to serious career discussions. Morrison's response required careful navigation between acknowledging the inadequacies in current training while not completely undermining her own professional standing. "Sir, I believe today's demonstration revealed significant gaps in our understanding of achievable performance standards. Staff Sergeant Vasquez's capabilities clearly exceed what we've been teaching as maximum potential, and I think this presents an opportunity to reassess our training protocols." The conversation continued for nearly an hour with Morrison's superior, expressing concern that military training standards had become too focused on minimum competency rather than maximum capability development. The implication was clear. The viral video had created pressure for the military to explain why its current training seemed so limited compared to what one of its former members could accomplish after 8 years away from active service. Sergeant Kim faced a different kind of reckoning. His dismissal of extreme-range shooting as militarily useless had been captured on camera and was now being shared alongside footage of Elena's demonstration. Military historians and tactical analysts began posting detailed explanations of how Elena's record-setting shot had actually ended a major conflict, providing context that made Kim's statements appear not just wrong but dangerously ignorant of military history. The most painful consequence for Kim was personal rather than professional. His son, a Marine Lance Corporal currently deployed overseas, called him that evening after seeing the footage. "Dad, I can't believe you said those things about long-range shooting being useless. Half my unit has studied Operation Silent Thunder." As an example of how individual capability can have strategic impact. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez is a legend here, and you basically called her service meaningless on television." The conversation with his son forced Kim to confront the reality that his dismissive attitudes hadn't just been wrong. They had been disrespectful to veterans who had accomplished extraordinary things in service of their country. His apology, posted on social media the following day, was heartfelt but couldn't undo the damage to his reputation within the veteran community. The broader impact extended far beyond the individuals who had been directly involved in the day's events. Military recruitment offices across the country reported increased interest from young people who had seen the footage and were inspired by Elena's demonstration of what was possible with proper training and dedication. The video had accomplished what thousands of traditional recruitment campaigns had failed to achieve. It had shown potential recruits that military service offered opportunities for truly exceptional achievement. Jessica Martinez became something of a minor celebrity herself after footage showed her enthusiastic reaction to Elena's shot. Her social media accounts were flooded with messages from other young women who had been inspired by seeing someone their age witness such an extraordinary demonstration of capability. Military recruiters began reaching out to her directly, offering information about advanced training programs that she had never known existed. The high school senior found herself in demand for interviews with local media outlets, all wanting to capture her perspective on the day's events. "What I learned today," she told a reporter from the Omaha World-Herald, "is that I've been setting my goals too low. I was thinking about maybe becoming a decent soldier, but Staff Sergeant Vasquez showed me that with the right training and mindset, you can literally change history. That's what I want to do now, not just serve my country, but serve it at the highest possible level." The story reached national attention when CNN picked up the footage for their evening newscast, framing it as a story about hidden heroes and the extraordinary capabilities that exist within the veteran community. The segment featured interviews with military historians who provided context about Operation Silent Thunder and Elena's role in ending the conflict, transforming her from a viral sensation into a recognized figure in military history, defense contractors, and military training. Organizations began reaching out to Elena within hours of the story going national. Companies that specialized in advanced marksmanship training wanted to hire her as an instructor, while weapons manufacturers offered consulting contracts to help develop equipment for extreme-range shooting applications. The quiet waitress who had wanted nothing more than anonymity suddenly found herself at the center of a bidding war for her expertise. The most significant consequence was institutional. Within 48 hours of the footage going viral, the Pentagon announced a comprehensive review of current marksmanship training standards across all service branches. The review was explicitly prompted by questions about why current training appeared to fall so far short of demonstrated capabilities, and whether artificial limitations were preventing service members from reaching their full potential. Colonel Hayes, who had orchestrated Alana's attendance at the Veterans Appreciation Day, found herself testifying before a Defense Department panel about the gaps between current training and achievable performance. Her presentation included Alana's demonstration as evidence that military capabilities were being artificially constrained by trainers and administrators who didn't understand what was actually possible with proper instruction and adequate resources. The ripple effects extended to military academies and training schools across the country, where instructors suddenly found themselves questioned by students who had seen Alana's footage and wanted to know why they weren't being taught to shoot at similar distances. Training curricula that had remained unchanged for decades were suddenly under scrutiny, with students and administrators alike demanding explanations for why standards seemed so low compared to demonstrated capabilities. Alana herself remained largely unavailable for comment during the initial media frenzy, having returned to Millfield with the understanding that her quiet life was over, but uncertain about what would replace it. The phone calls and interview requests poured in, but she declined most of them, choosing instead to take time to process the dramatic change in her circumstances and consider what her next step should be. The transformation from hidden hero to public figure had happened faster than she could have imagined, and the responsibility that came with her newfound visibility was something she was still learning to navigate. But as she watched the coverage of her demonstration and saw the impact it was having on young people like Jessica Martinez, Alana began to understand that her 8 years of hiding might have been preparation for a different kind of service, one that used her story and capabilities to inspire the next generation of military professionals to exceed what they had been told was possible. 3 months after the Veterans Appreciation Day demonstration that changed everything, Alana stood before a classroom of Marine sniper candidates at Quantico, Virginia. The transition from small-town waitress to senior marksmanship instructor had happened with a speed that still sometimes left her feeling disoriented. The Marines had created a special position for her, Senior Technical Advisor for Advanced Marksmanship Training, that allowed her to reshape how the military approached long-range shooting instruction. The classroom was filled with 24 of the most promising marksmen and women from across the corps, all competing for slots in the Advanced Sniper program. Among them was Jessica Martinez, who had enlisted immediately after graduation and had excelled through every stage of basic training and preliminary marksmanship instruction. She sat in the front row, her attention completely focused on Alana, as she prepared to deliver her first formal lecture on extreme-range shooting techniques. For the past decade, Alana began, her voice carrying the authority that came from actual combat experience. Military marksmanship training has been built around artificial limitations that have nothing to do with human capability or equipment potential. You've been taught that shots beyond 1,000 meters are exceptional, that anything past 1,500 meters is impossible, and that consistency at extreme ranges is a fantasy. Today, we begin unlearning those limitations. Alana activated the presentation screen behind her, which displayed a map of the Kandahar province marked with distances and terrain features. Operation Silent Thunder required a shot at 3,540 meters under combat conditions that included hostile fire, extreme heat, and variable winds. The mission succeeded not because of luck or perfect conditions, but because the training I had received prepared me to exceed what others considered possible. One of the candidates, a staff sergeant with extensive combat experience, raised his hand. "Ma'am, with respect, how do we know that current limitations aren't based on practical considerations? Maybe the reason we don't train for extreme range shots is because the tactical situations that require them are too rare to justify the resources." Elena smiled, recognizing the kind of practical skepticism that she had once shared. "Staff Sergeant, that's exactly the mindset that needs to change. We don't train for extreme capabilities because we expect to use them regularly. We train for them because when the situation arises, nothing else will suffice." The peace negotiations that ended the Afghanistan conflict were possible because one person was capable of making an impossible shot at the critical moment. She moved to the next slide, which showed statistical comparisons between traditional training outcomes and the results achieved by students who had been trained using Elena's enhanced protocols. The improvements were dramatic, average effective. Ranges had increased by 40%. Accuracy at traditional distances had improved significantly, and most importantly, the psychological barriers that had limited student performance had been largely eliminated. "The most important change we're implementing," Elena continued, "isn't technical, it's psychological. We're teaching you to think in terms of what's possible rather than what's traditionally been achieved. When you believe that 800-meter shots are your maximum capability, that belief becomes a self-fulfilling limitation. When you understand that 800 meters is barely the beginning of your potential, your performance changes accordingly." Jessica Martinez raised her hand, her enthusiasm evident despite the formal classroom setting. "Ma'am, how do we overcome the mental barriers that make extreme-range shooting seem impossible? When I look through a scope at a target 1,500 meters away, part of my brain keeps saying that hitting it is basically luck rather than skill." Elena nodded, appreciating the honesty of Jessica's question. "Maureen Martinez, that voice in your head is the result of years of being told that certain achievements are impossible. We overcome it the same way we overcome any other form of inadequate training, through repetition, education, and gradually expanding our understanding of what we can accomplish." She paused, looking around the classroom. "By the end of this program, you'll routinely make shots that your instructors 6 months ago would have told you were impossible." The training program that Elena had developed combined traditional marksmanship instruction with advanced techniques that had previously been reserved for the most elite special operations units. Students learned to calculate for atmospheric conditions that most military snipers never encountered, to account for the Coriolis effect of the Earth's rotation, and to maintain precision under environmental stresses that would have been considered prohibitive under traditional training models. More importantly, Elena's program addressed the psychological and cultural barriers that had prevented military marksmen from reaching their full potential. Students were required to regularly attempt shots at distances that exceeded traditional training parameters, not because they were expected to succeed immediately, but because the attempt itself expanded their understanding of what was achievable. With sufficient practice and proper technique, the results had been remarkable even in the early stages of implementation. Students who had been told throughout their military careers that 600-meter shots represented advanced marksmanship were consistently hitting targets at twice that distance within weeks of beginning Lana's program. The psychological breakthrough that occurred when they realized their previous limitations had been artificial, rather than real, created a cascade of improved performance across all aspects of their training. Colonel Hayes, who had been promoted and placed in charge of the Marine Corps' marksmanship modernization effort, visited the classroom regularly to observe Elena's teaching methods. "What Staff Sergeant Vasquez has accomplished here," she told a group of visiting Pentagon officials, "is nothing short of revolutionary. We're not just teaching better shooting techniques, we're teaching our people to think differently about human potential and military capability." The success of Elena's program had attracted attention from across the military establishment. Special operations units that had previously guarded their training methods jealously were now sending representatives to observe Elena's classes and incorporate her techniques into their own instruction. The artificial barriers between different levels of military training were breaking down as it became clear that extraordinary capability could be developed systematically rather than stumbled upon accidentally. Elena's personal transformation had been as dramatic as her professional one. The quiet waitress who had spent 8 years avoiding attention had become one of the most sought-after instructors in the military. But more importantly, she had found a way to integrate her extraordinary past with a meaningful present, using her unique experiences to prepare the next generation of military professionals for challenges that previous training would have left them unprepared to meet. The impact extended beyond the military. Elena's story had inspired thousands of people to reconsider their own assumptions about personal limitations and achievable goals. Her demonstration that extraordinary capability could be hidden within ordinary appearances had sparked conversations about talent recognition, potential development, and the ways that society might be overlooking exceptional abilities in unexpected places. Jessica Martinez, now excelling in advanced training that she would never have attempted without Elena's inspiration, had become something of a symbol for the program's success. Her journey from a high school student whose aspirations had been nearly crushed by expert dismissal to a Marine sniper candidate pushing the boundaries of military marksmanship demonstrated the transformative power of proper instruction and unlimited expectations. As Elena concluded her lecture and watched her students prepare for their afternoon training exercises, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that morning at the Veterans Appreciation Day. The anonymity she had spent 8 years building was gone forever, replaced by a responsibility to use her extraordinary experiences in service of others. The woman who had ended a war with a single impossible shot had found a new mission, ensuring that the next generation of military professionals understood that impossible was simply another word for untrained, the quiet revolution that had begun with one demonstration shot was transforming military marksmanship training across all service branches, creating new standards based on actual human potential rather than traditional limitations. Elena Vasquez had stopped hiding from her extraordinary past and had instead chosen to use it as a foundation for an equally extraordinary future, one that would prepare countless others to exceed what they had been told was possible. In reclaiming her identity as both a warrior and a teacher, Elena had discovered that true service sometimes required not just the courage to make impossible shots, but the wisdom to show others that they too were capable of achieving the impossible when properly trained and encouraged to exceed artificial limitations. 2 years later, Elena received a video call that brought everything full circle. On her screen appeared Jessica Martinez, now Staff Sergeant Martinez, calling from a forward operating base in Eastern Europe. Behind Jessica, Elena could see other Marines setting up advanced sniper equipment. "Ma'am," Jessica said, her voice crackling through the satellite connection, "I wanted you to know, we just completed a mission that required a 2,100-meter shot to neutralize a threat that was preventing humanitarian aid from reaching civilians. 3 years ago, I was told that kind of shot was impossible. Yesterday, I made it on the first attempt." Elena felt a familiar tightness in her throat as she realized that her decision to reveal her identity, to abandon her quiet anonymity, had created a ripple effect that was still saving lives around the world. The young woman who had once been discouraged by experts claiming extraordinary marksmanship was fantasy had become living proof that human potential far exceeded traditional limitations. "The shot was clean, ma'am. No casualties except the target. And 3,000 civilians got the supplies they needed. My spotter said it was textbook execution, exactly like you taught us at Quantico." Jessica's smile filled the screen. I thought you should know that your story is still changing lives, still proving that impossible is just another word for untrained. As Alina ended the call, she looked out the window of her new office at Quantico, where the next class of advanced marksmanship students was preparing for their first extreme range exercise. The quiet waitress from Millfield was gone forever, replaced by someone who had learned that the greatest service sometimes meant stepping out of the shadows to light the way for others. If this story inspired you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join our community of everyday heroes with extraordinary stories. What incredible talents might be hidden in your own community? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one and love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.